Alrighty, hello everyone. Welcome in. We're just giving it a few minutes for folks to roll on in. I'll start it in a few minutes. It's one of our presenters. Wonderful. Good morning, Colin. All right, I am going to get us started here today. And I'm going to run through some information before we get to our presenters, which I know we're all very excited for. So, hello, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome to the European Frogbit Collaborative webinar series. We have some excellent speakers who have agreed to share their work with us today. Presenters from Michigan Tech Research Institute will be sharing their work regarding demonstration of high-resolution drone-enabled mapping of European frogbit and other invasive aquatic plants in the Great Lakes region. My name is Nicole Angel, and I'm joined by my colleagues Samantha Tink and Autumn McGowan with the Great Lakes Commission. And on behalf of the European Frogbit Collaborative, we want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. So before I turn the presentation over to our presenters, I just wanted to provide some background on the collaborative if you're not familiar. So the European Frogbit Collaborative was convened in 2018 when the state of Michigan was identified. The state of Michigan identified EFB as a priority, and then got funding from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grant in collaboration with Central Michigan University. So once this initial supporting structure was established, an adaptive management framework was developed, and CMU was established as a technical advisory group. And then finally, stakeholders in Michigan were engaged and encouraged to participate. And initially, this work was really Michigan-centric, but as EFB sort of grew and became a larger issue, the need for this type of framework also grew. So that's when in 2021, the Great Lakes Commission was identified to provide neutral backbone support for this framework and was subsequently awarded funding to do just that and to continue to expand the EFB collaborative framework that was put in place by Michigan. So here is a visual depiction of the governance structure for the EFB collaborative. There are currently 64 members as part of the collaborative coming from various different organizations across the Great Lakes Basin. So the steering committee provides strategic guidance and directs the collaborative's work, as well as speaks on behalf of the collaborative and makes decisions on what to work on. So there's 3 different work groups comprised of subject matter experts that focus on specific aspects of European frogbit, including prioritization, management assessment, and education and outreach. The collaborative membership at large is represented by the white box on this diagram, and they give input on all the products that the collaborative develops. And then, as mentioned prior, the GLC provides neutral backbone support to the collaborative, including facilitating meetings and keeping everyone on track to achieve the goals and objectives set out by the collaborative. So the collaborative has a regional strategy that was established, and it serves to guide the work of the collaborative from 2024 to 2026. So we're about halfway through our regional strategy. And this strategy is founded upon 3 core focus areas, those being regional coordination and collaboration, best management planning, and research and information needs. This strategy really helps shape what the work groups focus on that I mentioned prior. Speaking of those work groups, I wanted to quickly highlight some of the recent accomplishments of each of those work groups. We'll start with the prioritization work group. So this work group was charged with reviewing information on where EFB is impacting Great Lakes resources, identifying criteria for evaluating sites based on that information, and then developing a system for prioritizing sites for potential management activities. This work group is currently working on a demo version of a new tool that will help managers prioritize where to both monitor for and manage EFB. All right, moving on to the management assessment work group. The goals of this work group are to develop a tool that managers can use to easily track their EFB monitoring and management actions, and then use that data to help determine what are the best management practices for EFB. So this work group really recently developed a new field maps application to accomplish these goals called FrogMap, which is the European FrogMap before and after treatment tracker. And an app SOP is published and it's in its second year of use. And then finally, moving on to the education and outreach work group, which is charged with informing, developing, and publicizing future EFB educational materials at both a local and regional scale. So recently, this work group organized and hosted successful EFB-related sessions at conferences, and they're working to develop fact sheets such as those shown on the screen, including a lookalikes fact sheet and a Lake Association flyer. So lots of good resources coming out of that group. And then finally, I just wanted to mention the delimitation work group, which wasn't pictured on the governance structure that I had shown before, because this work group has since completed its objectives and been phased out. This work group did develop a delimitation application where managers can report where they've seen EFB as well as where they've monitored for it. This really helps delimit EFB populations in the Great Lakes region. And then I just wanted to end my introduction by saying that there's lots of ways to engage with the collaborative community. If you're interested in participating or reaching out, we encourage that. And we do have a website that hosts archived literature and resources developed. We also have a quarterly newsletter with the latest and greatest EFB information. And then we always highlight our amazing collaborative mascot named Froggy, shown in the middle of the screen. So if you'd like to learn more about the collaborative or are interested in staying in touch with our communication networks, we do encourage it that you visit our website and join the listserv. And then finally, just a few logistical things. So while we do strive to minimize tech issues during the webinars, we do apologize for any that may arise. So before we get to our presentation, I just want to cover these few logistical items that we have automatically muted all attendees to reduce interruptions, and attendees will remain muted with webcams disabled throughout the webinar. We do encourage, however, and will accept written questions from attendees during the webinar. So if you have a question, please use that Q&A function. The Q&A function is specifically for questions. And then if you have any issues with tech or anything else, use the chat function for that. And questions can be submitted anytime during the webinar, but they will be addressed after the presentation has been given. If you're experiencing tech difficulties, you can use that chat box, or you can also email Sam, whose email is shown on the screen. And then now the moment we've all been waiting for is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Abby Jenkins and Colin Brooks. Abby or Colin, you can feel free to pull up your slides as I'm introducing you. I will stop sharing mine. And then Abby Jenkins is an assistant research scientist with the Michigan Tech Research Institute and has been using remote sensing technologies for transportation and ecological research for 4 years. Her research has focused on topics related to bridge and pavement inspection, invasive plant species mapping, and unstable slopes monitoring, among other things. Dr. Colin Brooks has over 30 years of experience in the application of remote sensing and GIS technologies to the modeling and understanding of transportation systems and environmental processes. He is a transportation practice area leader and senior research scientist for the Michigan Tech Research Institute, a research center at Michigan Tech University, where he is focused on transportation and ecological research since 2006. Colin has a PhD in biology from Michigan Tech University, a master's degree in environmental management from Duke University, and a bachelor's of science in pre-forestry from Lenoir-Rhine College.
The opportunity for Abby and I to present today. Very excited to talk about a project we've been working on with the Great Lakes Commission about using high-resolution drone-enabled mapping to identify a European frogbit and then other species of invasive aquatic plants. So the background to this, a lot of natural resource agencies, environmental groups are starting to have more and more access to drone technologies and qualified pilots. And there are potentials to use, I like the formal name of uncrewed aerial systems, UAS, or aquatic plant monitoring. Some folks may be familiar with that's what I did for my mid-career PhD that I finished in 2020, where I focused on identifying Eurasian water milfoil, working closely with Amanda Grimm, who's with the GLC nowadays. And partly out of this work and others, there really isn't standard guidance that exists for capturing and processing drone imagery that's useful for identifying invasive aquatic plants. And so more needs to be known about how drones or UAS can be used for identifying particularly specific species and their extent for submerged and floating aquatic plants. And then just because you've collected the imagery, that's not the entire process. Being able to process the imagery and then classify it into a map of specific plant species or taxa is a barrier that different Great Lakes jurisdictions have identified towards the practical use of this. So the current project, there is a steering committee for this aquatic plant with drones project. We are a contractor to the Great Lakes Commission that has a technical working group where we work closely with the GLC, and then we bring in other identified experts, and tribes and state agencies and others have the chance to participate in steering meetings. And if you want to know more about the steering committee, then please contact Sam Tank and she'll tell you more about that. So the specific goals of this project include being able to identify knowledge gaps for using UAS in aquatic invasive species surveillance, particularly in this case, talking about invasive aquatic plants, developing best practices, and then create an easy to use ArcGIS toolbox for analyzing the data collected by UAS. So more specifically, again, GLC established a steering committee and with our support, technical working group to provide the guidance and identify and document these best practices. We've done an in-depth literature review of recent articles on how drones can identify invasive aquatic plants. So we can summarize the current knowledge, identify knowledge gaps, and determine future research areas. And that publication will be forthcoming, or that document will be forthcoming out of this project. And then Amanda Grimm at GLC is leading the building of the ArcGIS toolbox that managers can use on a practical basis to analyze the drone imagery and produce the maps of vegetation cover types with a cookbook style tutorial and some example data from what we collected. And basically it'll require a copy of ArcGIS, but you will need either the spatial analyst or image analyst extension, which is an extra cost. Although a lot of people buy spatial analyst with desktop ArcGIS. And then out of this will come the guidance for how to collect and analyze the imagery that is tailored to what we're calling entry-level UAS users, so that this is practical for people to use. So out of a previous GLC and Nature Conservancy joint project, there was a list of priority plants that came out of the research agenda for the invasive aquatic plant control needs project. And this is the full list on there. You'll see that there's a variety of submerged and floating species and some emergent. And on our project, we've been focusing on some particular ones of these: Carolina fanwort, Brazilian waterweed, water hyacinth, hydrilla, European frogbit, parrot feather, Eurasian water milfoil, brittle naiad, starry stonewort, yellow floating heart. Haven't seen any water lettuce yet. Curly leaf pondweed are the main ones that we've been focusing on for this project. Abby, do you want to talk to some remote sensing slides here?
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to give a little overview of remote sensing. You heard that we are using drones to image European frogbit and other species. So this is good for basically covering a large area, especially if you're unable to get out there on foot or in boat. So we used RGB and multispectral cameras or sensors to image these plants. RGB is just optical or natural imagery, and multispectral has additional bands in the light spectrum, which is good for differentiating green plant species. And then we processed drone images into larger ortho images, which are geospatially accurate images of the full site. And that can then be put into algorithms, machine learning algorithms, to classify these different species in the image. So it's kind of an automated approach to mapping different species, including frogbit. Next slide. And as for classification methods, this is just a short overview. There's a lot more involved here, but basically we wanted to classify these ortho images with different machine learning algorithms to find the different species and know what their overall coverage is. So a couple of different methods include object-based classification or pixel-based. And an object-based, which is in this little image at the top here, you can see the image was segmented automatically by the computer. And then a person can actually assign different segments of what they know it is. So this is called the training data of the known spots that are going to train the classifier. And then pixel-based does not include segmentation. So essentially you would select different pixels or sections of the known species. And training data is important in these classifications in order to train the algorithm to know what is what and apply it to the whole image. So some different mathematical algorithms are random forests, support vector machines, and a few more that we tested. And different softwares that we tested were eCognition, which focuses on object-based methods, and ArcGIS Pro, which can do either method and all of the algorithms. So that was fun to test those different things. And so that's it for just our little overview of the more technical side of things.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, and as Abby was saying there, it's important to note that people that use the up-to-date versions of ArcGIS, if they have the spatial analyst license, have access to these machine learning methods like random forest and support vector machines, and that's a fairly new addition to ArcGIS. Those did not used to be available, but now everybody has access to them, and so when we write up our guide, we can with confidence know that these are tools that people have access to. So we are just starting the second field season for this project. We went out to a variety of places in 2024. We won't show you all the places. We'll just show you some examples, focusing on the two sites where we saw European frogbit and were able to use the drone imagery to help map its extent. So, but first, let me talk a little bit about the drone that we used. There are pending rules that can change what kind of drones could be used by people. The most commonly available drones are DJI Mavics. Depending what happens with some security reviews going on right now, it may be that DJI Mavics can no longer be used after 2025, but none of us know at this point whether that will be the case. So for this project, we wanted to go with a drone that had a potentially longer term use case scenario. Presumably there will be future ones that also come out. And we actually ended up recommending and using an Anzu Raptor, which is a Malaysian-made clone of the DJI Mavic 3, but uses US flight control software. And it can fly for up to about 35 minutes and comes with its own 20 megapixel red, green, blue, or natural color camera, like Abby was describing. And then in order to provide the multispectral capabilities, we created our own mounting combination that could take a Parrot Sequoia Plus multispectral imaging sensor, which has green, red, red edge, and near infrared. And the red edge and the near infrared have been proven particularly valuable in identifying different vegetation species. And as I said, we had a custom mount system to enable the Anzu Raptor to fly the Sequoia Plus. One of the things that you'll see is just flying a simpler setup with just a red, green, blue RGB camera can often differentiate the species, but the multispectral imagery can provide a different additional capability to differentiate species. So when we write up a final report, I expect us to be able to be saying RGB alone is good enough in many situations, but if you can have a system that includes multispectral, you will have added capability. But it is less practical to fly multispectral, although DJI makes a very nice multispectral drone. But again, its long-term use is undetermined at this point. Oops, this is not going to the next slide. Well, there we go. So the very first spot we went out and tested our equipment on last summer was at Lake Erie Metro Park. We'd had a report, there was a lot based upon MISON and GLC data. There was a lot of European frogbit out there. But as we found out, May 30th was a little early last year, so we did not actually see any European frogbit while we were out there. But you can also see some of our methods here. We go out there, we have these foldable Oru kayaks to get out to a site. We put down these red marker buoys that show up in the drone imagery, and we do a rake toss at that location. You can see me holding up the tossed rake there, and then we identify species and density by doing 3 rake tosses at each buoy point, and we do 2 to 3 buoy points and record that in a field form. And there's just one example of the multispectral band. I believe that's the near infrared, where the green vegetation shows up in a brighter color. So not overly interesting from a European frogbit point of view, but very, very useful in terms of getting our project off the ground last summer with these latest systems. And then the next site we went to was Allen Creek State Park in Ohio, where we were focused on hydrilla and brittle naiads, and we did see both species and were able to identify those in the drone imagery and have been working on classifications of those. And you can also see here in the top right, the area I had to fly out. It was fairly narrow, but with the flexibility of the drone is able to fly out and then up above the lake and get the imagery of that specific lake location. You can see us doing our rake toss there to check the species. Now, the first site where we actually did find European frogbit was Mentor Marsh near Cleveland, and then we found some small clumps of European frogbit and some larger areas of brittle naiads. Shipman Pond, which was nearby, we didn't find anything interesting. It looked like it's just been treated recently. But here, we went out with folks, we went out with colleagues, and then this was the main patch of European frogbit. We thought we would find more of it, but the main thing we found was one small patch, but at least it was distinct and clumped together and provided a useful first test of whether what the European frogbit looked like in the drone imagery. And so here are some examples of that. That small clump is in the circle area here. You can see our foldable kayaks. There is our monitoring buoy, and there is the distinct clump of the European frogbit you saw in a field photo. And this was one of the first classifications we did with the more complex and more expensive eCognition tool. But this tool has more advanced capabilities than the object-based classification in ArcGIS, but has its own separate cost. I think the academic cost is something like $3,500, and then you have to renew the license after that for a few $100s a year. So it's not the tool that we further investigated for use of the classifications, but it's one we kind of use as the gold standard if necessary. And then here, we're doing the classification results within ArcGIS Pro with the support vector machine. So again, focused in on that area, there's the clump of European frogbit, and it shows up very distinctly in there. And then some of the areas of submerged aquatic vegetation that were primarily brittle naiad also show up. And then the more emergent species are also very distinct as well. So another site we went to in Ohio was Metzger Marsh, recommended by our colleagues there, and this is closer to Toledo, so it's only about an hour away from Ann Arbor, and we did a full drone vegetation survey and we found significant presence of European frogbit and Eurasian water milfoil, and deemed it an excellent site for mapping. Here you can see we're sending our kayaks into the edge, and then some of this lighter color in here is the European frogbit. There's our fearless intern Sam holding up a successful finding of European frogbit. Close-up picture there, and amongst some, I believe, fragrant water lily and some duckweed. And there's an example of one of the larger areas that we were able to do in a single flight with the drone there. I think that was a single about 20-minute flight to get that kind of coverage. And so we initially thought it was going to be this area here that might be the predominant area of European frogbit. But as we were finishing the day, we went to visit a site on the southwest side of Metzger Marsh and found a fairly dense zone of European frogbit along the edge here. And it occupied a particular niche in this impounded area. We did not see it in the denser areas. We did not see it in the very shallowest. It was kind of in a zone in between where there was some open water, and it tended to form this paler pink color when looking at this in what's called false color infrared, which is where vegetation, essentially the greener it is or the greater biomass, the more red it is in the image. And so we were able to map it quite distinctly here in Metzger Marsh in this zone. And then one of our priorities for this summer is to go back and do a larger area within Metzger Marsh now that we know better where it tends to form the denser clumps, which are easier to see. And I just want to show just some other examples. So those are the main two European frogbit examples. Again, we should have some more, one or two more sites out of this summer's field work. We did some farmers' ponds that had yellow floating heart, and that was quite distinct and easier to identify where the yellow floating heart was using, in this case, we found, we did both the RGB orthophoto and the multispectral orthophoto, and came out with the a high quality classification using the random forest technique within ArcGIS Pro. This is another lake we did where it was largely yellow floating heart, and that was scattered around the edge, and that formed very distinct spectral signature in it and was fairly easy to map around the edge of this Timberlake Park in Solon, Ohio. And then the world famous Iron Horse Saloon in the upper part of the Cuyahoga River. There we were primarily looking at Carolina fanwort, Camamba caroliniana. And interestingly, we could identify it, but it was also, you can see here on this partially sideways picture with our marker buoy, you can see some of the Camamba, but also frequently it was covered in duckweed, and we're identifying the duckweed, not the Camamba. But that's something that happens fairly often with aquatic vegetation, is it get covered with another species such as duckweed and makes it hard to see. And there's both the RGB imagery and the multispectral. And then another site we did was Dodge No. 4 Park in Cass Lake, Michigan. And there we had originally gone there to potentially go find, go look at some reported Eurasian water milfoil, but we found extensive starry stonewort. We're able to identify that quite well using the random forest pixel-based classification. And there the multispectral data was very helpful, because with the red edge band, you can penetrate a couple feet into the water. And still pick up vegetation using that red edge band with the limited penetration, which has greater penetration than the near infrared. And then there's a zoomed in example of Cass Lake looking at the examples of the starry stonewort. So it formed this fairly distinct, few inches below the surface, kind of green, almost muck look. And that was the starry stonewort that we could differentiate from other species. So in 2025, we are intending to potentially visit some additional sites. I think we're going to be looking at more water hyacinth sites in particular, and then revisiting Metzger Marsh to map more European frogbit, and then appreciate input on some sites. And then this seems like the right group. If you have any hot sites in the greater Ann Arbor area where maybe we could sneak in an extra day of data collection to go identify some denser areas of European frogbit, we'd love to have some recommendations on that. Again, particularly things that are within a couple hours of Ann Arbor are relatively easy for us to do because project is in its second year, so we're trying to manage the remaining funds well. And we'll be meeting with the project steering committee to share these latest results and document them into clear, implementable guidelines. So happy to open it up for questions, whatever the best way is to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that great presentation. Really interesting work. I will now open up the Q&A and see what we have. I'm just going to take over screen sharing here for a minute.
Yep.
And again, just give you a big thank you. That was awesome. And then as a reminder, we're going to use the Q&A for questions, and I'll go through some of those now. So one question is, what elevation are you flying the drone at?
So it varies, but generally it's between 100 and 150 feet is most common. Abby, anything you want to add to that in terms of the height, some of the different heights we've tested?
I think we have tested below 100 feet. I think we got some 80 feet
That's right.
in areas where it was open tree, like there wasn't a lot of tree cover. So, but most of the time there was tree cover. We had to go over that, so about 100, 150.
Yeah, that's a good. Wherever possible, you can program these drones, including the Anzu Raptor, to do an automated flight, and then it gets the right amount of overlap in order to stitch the images together. And there is an Esri version of the couple of Esri software tools for stitching drone imagery together. One of them is called Drone to Map, which again is an extra cost. We tend to use a tool called Agisoft Metashape, but don't expect groups to have access to Agisoft Metashape, but maybe have access to the Esri equivalent to that. But when you use the automated flight software, it gets the right amount of overlap. But then the drones do have 6-direction collision avoidance on them, but you still would like to make sure it's not trying to detect a random tree branch and not run into it. So we tend to pick whatever safe height we can to fly automatically over the entire study area or mapping area.
Awesome. Another question from the same person. Did you test anything higher than 150 feet?
I have previously done higher than that. And then it really depends on the species you're trying to identify. If it forms larger areas in distinct clumps, you can identify it at higher heights. But for example, European frogbit, one of the things we saw at Metzger Marsh at the northeastern part of the site is it tended to be just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaves together. And so at the higher heights, they became too small to identify reliably. So for that site, because there was relatively little tree cover, 80 foot was producing better results for identifying the relatively small leaves of European frogbit.
Another related question to the elevation question, how tight of a grid do you fly at for good results?
So I always like to get at least 70% overlap. Oftentimes 80%, that amount of overlap is what defines the tightness of the grid. And we get usually 80 forward, 70% side overlap. So fairly dense. We have seen people do it with lower. I've seen some groups do 40-40 overlap, but then you really lower the probability you're going to get a high quality data set that you can merge together using the photogrammetry process. I saw another question come in through chat from Alex asking about, so we did try a polarizing filter when I was doing my dissertation work around 2015, 2016. And what we found is that although it did cut down on glare, and yes, glare could be an issue, it cut down so much of the available light coming in that the images were typically too dark. So I only used polarizing filters for one summer and then decided they were not worth the benefit.
Another question from the Q&A, are you pre-programming the flight or controlling it during the collection?
Whenever it's possible and safe to do so, we prefer to do pre-programmed flights. Oftentimes we might not program that flight till we get out there and get a view of the site and what it's really like maybe a tree is taller than we expected, or maybe there's a power line running to a home that we didn't notice. So we will often program it once we're out there. If it's a particularly small site, then you can probably manually get the overlap. But for the most part, to get the overlap in order to stitch the images together, program flights are generally better if you can safely use them.
Awesome. Another question, how do you decide on a classification method for a given invasive species? Is it a distinct method for each site? Does it depend on differences between species that are part of the community?
Abby, do you want to talk some about the classification methods?
Yeah, sure. So that was part of our research in testing different methods. So the object-based is usually better for species that are in larger clumps or more defined areas. And the pixel-based is a little bit better for species that are mixed in or in smaller areas. That was at least kind of a trend that we found. And then as for the algorithms that were used to classify, I think that is still in need of more research. But in general, the random forests seem to pick things out pretty well. And that is one of the most one of the most frequently used algorithms out there. So that made sense to us.
Yeah, object-based random forest definitely seems to be a frequently the best tool. And then RGB, the red, green, blue natural color imagery, produces sufficiently good results in most cases, but multispectral is adding value for some particular species and locations, but multispectral is more difficult to collect and it's also lower resolution. So if people are out there doing the RGB only, they may often find that sufficient. But if you can do multispectral, you'll get value out of that as well.
I would agree. I think the multispectral was only more valuable in a smaller number of species, maybe ones that are spectrally very similar to others.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I agree. And I see a question from longtime colleague Kurt Kowalski from down the street there. So what file sizes are you dealing with given the technology that you used? I can't remember how much, like the southwest corner of Metzger Marsh there, how big the stitched together image is or how many pictures we took. I mean, it was several hundred pictures. Abby, does that sound right?
Yeah, definitely several hundred. I can look it up right now. Sorry.
Oh yeah, I don't. You'll want to have you'll want to have a couple of terabytes set aside if you're doing lots of sites in a summer, or at least a few hundred gigabytes. I just don't remember these file sizes safe to do a single representative site. That's a good question. You'll never be sad that you have some extra storage space if you're doing drone work, and that can be an issue, realizing that, especially if you're doing an enterprise system where you have automated backup, that can start getting pricey in some situations.
All right, another question from the Q&A. How do you estimate the time and cost on a per unit area basis, or is this something you're determining through the field campaign?
I'd say we're still determining that. I mean, we know that we can go out there and do this. We know how much the drone costs. The drone was and for some reason I'm forgetting it. I think the drone was a little under $5,000. Adding the multispectral is about $4,000. So that cost can get distributed over multiple data collections over multiple years. And then the other cost is sending, we recommend a minimum team of 2, 3 if you can, but 2 is the minimum. You need the drone pilots who can also help with the field work, and then you need the drone spotter. We always recommend having a spotter who also then helps with the field work. Having a third person to help with species identification can be helpful. And then the size of the area, really, I mean, we can fly at about 80 feet high. We can fly 80 feet high. We can probably fly about 10 acres in about 20 minutes. And then it's more a case of are the locations close by enough to be able to do that? Because you definitely want to maintain line of sight with the drone. Those are what the standard FAA rules are. But I think I agree that it's going to be important to come out with some per unit costs on that.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A or chat. Sam, correct me if I'm wrong. I did have a question. I was wondering, were there differences in the ability to detect emergent versus submergent plants?
So my short version of that is emergent is relatively easy. Submergent is what's hard, and why I ended up doing it for my mid-career dissertation there is, the species may not be close to the surface. The water can have different, it could have different levels of sediment or tannins that make it hard to see into the water. Generally, if the vegetation they're trying to see is in relatively clear water within particularly the first 2 or 3 feet, but I did show in my dissertation work that we can map Eurasian water milfoil that was as deep as 6 feet in relatively clear water up there near the Lational Islands. So it's definitely harder with submerged aquatic vegetation, but it is possible. It just depends on the particulars of the site.
Interesting. All right, we did have one more question come in. How is the blue list influencing your efforts?
So indeed, and the blue UAS list, so it's very important to remember that list was intended, the original intention for it was to be for the Department of Defense to buy certain drones that had US, or it actually included a couple of European, but primarily US made drones that had gone through security procedures. It was never supposed to be used by all federal agencies for what drones were acceptable for the federal agencies to buy. But that's how many they've just gone the easy route and gone, well, if it's past the DoD security, then that's all then that's acceptable for us. There's another effort called the Green List that's supposed to expand. That's probably a little bit better focus in terms of its past security reviews, but it's not critical that it meets DoD specifications. But for this project in particular, we went the Anzu Raptor route, which is not on any restricted entity list, which is another thing that the government has on what drones and what companies you can buy. Whether that could change, I don't know at this point. It is something I try to keep up on. The Anzu Raptor does specifically have US-made flight control software. So it is not a blue UAS, but it should not get restricted under the security review that's happening separately from the blue UAS list of foreign-made drones. But it's unpredictable at this point. There are no affordable blue UAS, and affordable I'm just going to define as under $10,000 for right this moment, that have multispectral capabilities. Parrot used to make one. We did also try the Parrot Anafi USA, which is a blue UAS, with the Parrot Sequoia multispectral drone with a custom mount made for us by a company. But even though it was made specifically for that blue UAS, we could not get it to fly successfully. It was too much weight. So the only blue UAS list that somebody had published a paper or published some work on to fly a multispectral drone, we could not get to work. And we've been flying drones since 2011. I feel like we should have been able to get it to. So that's when we actually pivoted to using the Anzu Raptor as a non-DJI one that could fly a multispectral sensor, the same Parrot Sequoia, but long-term, hopefully a US or a US approved company will develop its own multispectral system where we don't have to, use a custom 3D printed mount so you can have multispectral, or people will have to use more expensive RGB only drones in the near future while the market sorts itself out as the blue UAS and foreign entity review processes happen that are ongoing. So it's very complicated and it's in flux.
I feel like there's a lot of things that are that way right now. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or the chat as of now. So I think we can close our webinar. Again, I just want to give a big thank you to Colin and Abby. Really interesting work. And thank you all for joining us today. The webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the European Frogbit Collaborative website in the next few days. And if you have any additional follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at the Great Lakes Commission. Everyone have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to present.
Thank you.